Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third part of our series presented by the Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. Today, we have two special guests from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But right now, we're just going to give a couple minutes for people to join. So if, Brendan, if you could please put the survey on the screen, and if you all can please participate, we will ask you today, according to the Department of Labor's list of goods, so please don't look online, but which of these has been proven to be produced by child labor or forced labor? So we have Christmas decorations, alcoholic beverages, baked goods, or all of the above. So if you could please submit to this poll, and then we will get to the discussion after we get all participation. And also, while we're waiting, just a reminder of etiquette for today. We will ask you all to, besides our special guests, please turn off your cameras and your microphones. And if you do have a question, please submit it in the chat to everyone, or you could direct it to our Karen Lynn. She is going to send them to me, and I will moderate the Q&A at the end of our initial discussion. So again, go ahead and take time to submit to that survey question on your screen. And if you have any questions throughout the chat, you can please put them in the chat. I am Tricia Kennelly, and I am on the advisory board for the aforementioned Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, which are bringing you this presentation series, which is actually our second that we've presented during this pandemic period, all of which have been recorded and are accessible on the UCF Global's YouTube channel. So if you weren't able to join us, you can still watch it. Today, we'll be discussing conscious consumers with special guests from Customs and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So we'll talk about the role they play in preventing importation of goods made by forced labor. When I'm not a advisor board, I'm also a producer for WUCF, and with the help of all of your great research, I try to bring awareness to the issue of human trafficking with the content I produce as often as possible. So for now, though, to hear more about the HTMS Center, our loving acronym for it, it is third of its kind in the nation and first of its kind in Florida. And to hear more about it, we'll hear from Shilpa Finnerty, please.
Thank you, Tricia. Hi, I'm Shilpa Finnerty. I'm Senior Fellow and Community Advisor for the Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. As Tricia said, we like to call it the HTMS Center for short. Thank you all for joining us for the last in our three-part series from March. A little bit about the center. Our main goals are community engagement, research, education, training, and survivor scholarships and student fellowships. So these webinar lunch and learns have been a really great way for us to stay connected with you all and continue our goal of community engagement and education while we're all working remotely and continuing to learn and work on this important issue. So thanks so much for joining us. And we will be planning another series for the summer, so please look out for that. And I'll hand it back over to Tricia now.
Thank you, Shilpa. As I mentioned, our two guests today are from the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. We have Therese Randazzo, who is the director of the Forced Labor Division. Therese, can you please turn your camera on so we can all see you? And also with her, we have her trade analyst, Stephanie Riddick. So today, before we get into my Q&A, your team, Therese and Stephanie, wanted to do a 20-minute presentation for all of us. So I will pass it on to you two. Thank you.
So to begin, Stephanie is actually going to lead us off with the first few slides, and then I will take the second half of the presentation. So Stephanie, please.
Stephanie, you are muted. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Riddick, and again, I'm an international trade analyst in the Forced Labor Division of the Customs and Border Protection. I want to thank Central Florida University and your Center for Human Trafficking for inviting us today. It's really great that you have that center, and I look forward to learning more about it. We are going to talk about forced labor today, and it's a very important and timely topic and an exciting topic because it is something that we can have an impact on, and our government is doing that, and there's an opportunity for everyone to prevent forced labor products from coming into our country. Let's go to the next slide. So let's just start out a little bit by defining what we mean by forced labor as we work with it, which is very important. You want to characterize forced labor by a work or service that is to be provided, and it could be all different kinds of work across all different parts of our economy and a large number of products. And, you know, it could be along with mining, it could be agriculture, it could be a lot of different areas where work is provided. But what makes it forced labor is the involuntariness of it. And that means that someone is being required to work, to provide a service in a very involuntary way. Along with that is the menace of penalty. The reason why we go through and deal with forced labor and try and prevent forced labor is because the menace of a lot of penalties, and we'll talk briefly about some of those in a few minutes. But if your wages are being withheld, if you are being forced to work in unsanitary or difficult conditions, poor labor conditions, if you're isolated from any means of accessing your rights, those are the type of things that we want to prevent and avoid. And lastly, they can be imposed by governments as well. Often we're talking about industries, we're talking about a lot of different businesses where you may find forced labor, but government can also impose forced labor, particularly in areas of institutionalization like prisons, and other areas. So, and that's a very difficult type of forced labor to deal with because you're dealing with a foreign government with its own laws, its own economy, its own way of doing business. And that can be a very difficult way of addressing forced labor. Okay, let's go to the next one. So we have some basic statistics here on what forced labor is all about and where it is. And I think this map, if you'll take a look at it, is very instructive. The first thing you'll notice is that the entire map of the globe is covered, unfortunately, which means we do find forced labor in all parts of the world, including in developed countries. Much of the forced labor we find is in less developed countries, but no part of the world is immune to it. And that's why it's important that we work across government, across industry, across civil society, and across academia. And I really appreciate academia being involved in this as well. It's very important that all sectors of our economy and society are aware of forced labor. You can see that there's a very large percentage and number of forced labor incidents in Asia, but of course they have a larger population than other parts of the world. But all areas of the globe are touched by forced labor. And I think that's very important to know as you look at the products you buy, as you're studying the economies of the world, as you're looking at our own society and really consider, where forced labor might be. And unfortunately, it could be anywhere. But we're working hard to prevent that and to identify it. So it's estimated right now that close to 25 million people are victims of forced labor worldwide. They are trapped in jobs that they cannot get out of, and that goes back to the involuntariness of it and the menace of penalty that we talked about briefly. I think it's useful that it's broken up here by sectors. 16 million exploited in the private economy. So it is a very largest part is private economy based. But we do have victims of forced sexual exploitation. That's another close to 5 million. And then by state authorities, like we talked about, governments can also impose forced labor on individuals, and that adds up to another 4 million. And that can be a very challenging situation for our government to deal with. So definitely keep the map in mind and just be aware that forced labor can occur anywhere. And we will have that source at the end. The International Labor Organization is where we have compiled this information, and we'll have resources at the end that you can take a look at. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So forced labor, as we work with it as a part of the United States government, is based on a law. And I'll just go through that because I think it's important that we all have a common understanding legally of what forced labor means. So as we have it defined, all goods, wares, articles, and merchandise mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part in any foreign country by convict labor and or forced labor or an indentured labor under penal sanctions shall not be entitled to entry at any ports of the United States, and the importation thereof is prohibited. So that was based on a law passed in 1930. And again, now it includes goods manufactured wholly or in part, because as you know, many of the products in our economy and many that we import are, there are many different parts, and those parts can be made in many different countries. And some of those parts could be made with forced labor. So we really have to look at supply chains and understand very clearly where all of the parts for automobiles, for garments, for a lot of different products come from, because it's very important that we understand that and make sure that no part of any of those products that come into our country are produced with forced labor. So back in 2016, we realized that there was a kind of a loophole in our law. Consumptive demand, that was repealed. And what that means is that prior to 2016, when the law was revised, you could have products come in with forced labor because the demand for the product in our country was high enough, and it was unclear that we'd be able to source that product any other way. But it was decided by Congress that that's unacceptable, that we should not import any products produced with forced labor. So the law was enacted in 2016 and has closed that loophole, and that's a good thing. So all the work that we do on forced labor in the government is based on laws, and you can certainly look that up and find out more about it. Okay, let's go to the next one. So these are the types of forced labor indicators that we look for when we go through and do our investigations, when we're doing our research, when we are enforcing forced labor according to the United States law. These are the type of indicators that we are looking for, and they are based on the International Labor Organization's forced labor indicators, which is very useful for us. We do work with international organizations, including the ILO. So taking just a quick look at these issues, isolation. A lot of the products that are produced in agriculture, in mining, on fishing vessels, something that I'm familiar with. This work occurs in very isolated parts of the country, out on a ship, in a mine. And this is a real problem, because if you are isolated, you really don't know your rights. You may not know your rights. You may not have access, to any type of legal protection. You are also isolated in terms of your living conditions, your working conditions. Some of the people have to work on site in these types of employment, and they may not have any transportation to be able to access, other products, other services, and legal protections. So isolation is very important, and we really have to take a look at that. And we really look at that hard when we're considering whether forced labor is part of a product that we are investigating. Physical and sexual violence. Obviously, if you are isolated, and you can be isolated not only in a distant place, you could be isolated, basically locked up in a work location and be unable to avoid physical and sexual violence. So I think that one's pretty explanatory, but this does happen in certain types of employment. And you probably maybe hear more about some of those with sex trafficking and so on. Restriction of movement, once again, if you are unable to access transportation from your employment, if you're isolated, if your documents are confiscated, your passport, things like that, then you have an inability, to access your right, to access services, to find out information about, how you may receive help if you find that you're in a forced labor situation. So the ability to move, to access services, to talk to other people, that's a very important forced labor indicator. Withholding of wages, well, we find that this one happens quite often. Individuals sign a contract to do work, but then they're not paid later on, or they're paid less than they deserve. So that's a real problem, and withholding the wages is a problem because a lot of people are sending these funds back to their families. If they don't have those funds, then their families can't be supported as well. Deception. There's a lot of deception that goes on in forced labor. If you are told that you're going to receive certain work benefits, if you're going to work a certain contract for a certain amount of time, and I see that picture, is showing a shark there. And because I've worked a bit with fishing vessels, that's really important because, once you go to work out on a ship, you're out there. And if you're forced to stay out there, then you really have no recourse to come back, or it's extremely difficult. So what you were told about, what your work is going to be, if that's not the case, then you can be forced to work in a way that you did not plan for and did not agree to. Excessive overtime. A lot of times we find in our investigations that people are being asked to work 15, 17, 20 hours a day. Again, that's not in the contract usually. So that's really important because if you are isolated, if your movements are restricted, it's a real problem. You can be forced to work more hours than you should be under any labor standard. Debt bondage is similar in the sense that a lot of times when individuals are recruited, they are told that they will have to pay back the recruiting fees. And, if you're not working enough hours, if they say you're not working enough hours, they can put you into debt, and you will continually be in debt and continually having to pay fees and other services of your employment, that in the end puts you in a forced labor situation that you have to keep working and you can never pay it off. So that's a real problem as well. There is intimidation and threats that go on in forced labor, threatening not to pay you, threatening your family, threatening not to send you home in the case of migrant workers. So there can be all different kinds of threats, and we do try and document these. Some of our civil society organizations partners have been really good at helping us document different types of threats and intimidation. Abuse of a vulnerability. So once again, a lot of these indicators are tied together. But if you are isolated, if you don't know the language, this is a situation that happens a lot with migrant workers. They don't know the language of the country they're working in. And so if you don't know that, then you're at a real disadvantage with your employer. And sometimes that disadvantage gets abused in terms of your contract, in terms of your working conditions and living conditions. And you can really be abused because you are vulnerable. And that goes to the next one as well. You're living in working conditions. Some of the working conditions are just really inhumane. Some of the working conditions we found on fishing vessels, on various plantations and so on, are just inhumane and unacceptable for us to import product from a country or region like that. And then lastly, retention of identity, documents and so on. Again, if your passports and documents are taken away from you, you're in a vulnerable situation. You may not be able to get home very easily, and have a lot of other issues, with not being able to identify who you are, that you have the right to work in that country, that you've been given official authority to work, and those kind of issues can come up. So those are some of the physical or some of the forced labor indicators that we are constantly investigating, constantly learning about, and we hope to learn more from research that might be done at your institution and others and across the US government and with our civil society organizations. And we do have that resource at the end. So if you want to learn more about forced labor indicators, just look at the slide at the end. Okay, and I'll turn it over to our director, Therese, to continue from there.
Thank you, Stephanie. And we will hear more from you later in our discussion. If anyone has any questions for Stephanie, please put them in the chat or direct them right to Karen Lynn. Therese, thank you in advance for your part of the discussion.
Thanks, Tricia, and thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate you doing the introductory part of the presentation and giving folks the background on forced labor. If we could move to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how CBP actually goes about enforcing the law that prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor. As you can see here, we have quite a number of stakeholders who are interested in this issue. Over the last few years, Stephanie mentioned the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act, that closed the loophole in the law back in 2016. Since then, we've seen a lot more engagement from various stakeholders on forced labor as CBP's authority to take enforcement action has increased. So some of our stakeholders can include Congress and the White House. This is actually a bipartisan issue in Congress. So it's actually one that I think, frequently there's a lot of division in our Congress, but right now there is a great deal of unity on both sides, on both the Republican and Democratic parties, to take action against forced labor. Other stakeholders include other US government agencies who were involved in different ways than CBP in combating forced labor. So for example, negotiating clauses in trade agreements that would prohibit the importation of forced labor, or setting up programs with foreign governments to raise capacity and awareness there to deal with forced labor conditions. We also have extensive engagement with the business community, most often the US importing community, but also the international business community as well, because those are the entities that are the targets of our forced labor investigations. Stephanie mentioned non-governmental and civil society organizations. Those are really crucial stakeholders because we receive many of the leads that we use to develop forced labor cases from these entities. They also provide a lot of information to help us with corroborating information that we may have received. International organizations and foreign governments also play a role here. We do, as Stephanie mentioned, the International Labor Organization. We use their indicators in determining whether forced labor conditions exist. And then we also are working with foreign governments. This is an issue that is starting to catch attention around the world as more governments look at putting programs in place, putting laws in place, putting initiatives into place that would counteract forced labor, that would that prevent the importation or otherwise counteract forced labor, for example, through the issuance of sanctions. Next slide, please. So I mentioned forced labor investigative leads. So we get leads actually from a wide variety of people. As a matter of fact, anyone can submit a lead to us if they suspect forced labor. We have you can do this via our website. There's an e-allegations portal on cbp.gov that any of these entities can use to provide information to us on suspected forced labor conditions. So we get them from individuals who may have been victims or witnesses to forced labor conditions. We get them from the private sector, from the business community, from the CSOs and NGOs, as I previously mentioned. We also get information from partner government agencies, particularly the Department of Labor and the Department of State, and the intelligence community as well. And we also get information sometimes from intergovernmental organizations in other countries regarding forced labor conditions. So let's turn now to what do we do with that information. Next slide. So this is a high-level overview of the forced labor process, the way that CBP goes about conducting forced labor enforcement. So we receive information from the allegations of forced labor from a variety of our sources. Once we receive that information, we analyze that to determine, is there a connection to US imports, because we're only able to take action if it is a product that is being imported or likely to be imported into the United States. So we look at the information that's provided in the allegation, and we look for the 11 indicators that Stephanie talked about. as long as there's, we will take action, we can take action as long as there's one of those indicators present. So it doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 5 or 10. It's actionable as long as there's one. Now, we don't take the information that's presented to us at face value. We have to corroborate that information. So we conduct an investigation that would look to other sources that might say that this condition also exists. And the reason that we do that is because it's to prevent, it's to make sure that the situation is actually happening, that this is not, for example, a complaint being put forward anonymously by a competitor in order to hurt a domestic business in the United States. So if we determine with reasonable suspicion that one or more of the forced labor indicators exist, then we'll issue a withhold release order, or WRO. A WRO is an instruction to our ports of entry, all 328 of them, to detain shipments that are arriving in the United States that involve products that are from a country that is the subject of a WRO. For example, there's a WRO on cotton from Turkmenistan, or on tobacco from Malawi, or on specific cases like on disposable gloves produced by Top Glove out of Malaysia. And then you may have also heard, there's been a lot in the news lately about the conditions in Xinjiang in China regarding the Uyghur population there. So we have a WRO on cotton and tomato products that are produced in the Xinjiang by forced labor. Those are just a few examples of the many WROs that we have. Once we have the targeting in place and we start stopping shipments at the border, that's referred to as a detention. So CBP detains those shipments, and the importer has a 3-month period in which to prove to us that the goods were not made with forced labor, so they're not subject to the withhold release order. If the importer is able to do that, then we will release those goods into the commerce of the United States. If the importer is not able to do that, then those goods will be denied entry and the importer will have to re-export them. The importer also has the option to export those goods at any time once they arrive in the United States. If we have a higher level of proof that forced labor conditions are happening, if we have probable cause rather than reasonable suspicion, because probable cause is a higher level of evidence than reasonable suspicion. We establish probable cause, then we would issue a finding. A finding is very similar to withhold release order in the sense that goods that arrive in the United States are again detained and the importer has an opportunity to establish that the goods were not made with forced labor, in which case we would admit them into the commerce of the United States. However, if the importer is unable to establish that, then the goods will be seized by CBP and will commence forfeiture proceedings. There is no opportunity under a finding for the importer to export those goods. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that we usually are using when we're talking to the business community. Under US law, importers have an obligation to exercise reasonable care to ensure that merchandise they import into the United States complies with US law. That includes forced labor in 19 U.S.C. 1307. We refer importers to the U.S. Department of Labor's Comply Chain application, as well as to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development's due diligence guidance for information on how to establish a social compliance program so that they can make sure that their supply chains do not contain goods made with forced labor. In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the details of what would go into a social compliance program, because that's really something more geared to a business audience. And I understand today we're focused on consumers. Next slide, please. So this is the references that Stephanie mentioned. The first one up here is the ILO indicators of forced labor. If you're interested in more information on those indicators, there is a brochure on the ILO's website. They also publish another publication called Harder to See, Harder to Count, which surveys forced labor. Then we have another ILO publication on the worst forms of child labor. The two that we use the most often and that I would recommend to you if you are interested in, actually I'll give you 3. If you're interested in looking at where you might find information on goods that might be made with forced labor, You can look to the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child or forced labor, where they list different products and countries where there is forced or child labor involved in the production of those goods. It doesn't mean they're necessarily being imported into the United States, but it does tell you what types of products in which countries are made with forced labor. I would also refer you to the Department of State's Trafficking in Persons report. That report is really more about what foreign governments are doing to counteract human trafficking, but it does give indications of forced labor, the existence of forced labor in various countries. There's also the CBP website. The forced labor page on our website contains a wealth of information regarding forced labor, including a list of all the products and countries against which we have issued withhold release orders or findings. I will highlight that today we're actually issuing a new finding today on disposable rubber gloves made by Top Glove out of Malaysia. And then finally, this is a reference to the law 19 U.S.C. 1307, and this is the implementing regulations at 19 Code of Federal Regulations 1242 to 1245. And I will wrap up here so that we have time for questions.
Thank you, Therese. And yes, we will definitely get to audience Q&A, so please submit any questions you have. But Stephanie, if you both can take my questions first and foremost. So Stephanie, you shared some stats that are pretty daunting. And we know with the prevalence of threat and deception, as you mentioned, in the slave community, that also the data may not be as accurate because, you know, in many cases, the slave can't say that they are enslaved. As you know, they may be threatened. And so what more can be done from a law enforcement perspective to really make an impact on these numbers?
Okay, great. I think I'll let Therese start the answer to that question since she's at a management level. But good question.
Great, thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So I think that in terms of what else can be done from a law enforcement perspective, I think we are working to issue additional withhold release orders, additional findings. But I think more broadly, when you look at law enforcement, what's important is that the Department of Homeland Security did establish a Center for Countering Human Trafficking. So and that center is working to conduct criminal investigations into forced labor. So if you are an importer and you are knowingly importing goods that are made with forced labor, you are subject to potential criminal prosecution and penalties as well. So I think that the action by the Department of Justice to actually prosecute some of these cases will have an impact. But this is actually a much broader issue than law enforcement. It certainly involves a lot of other entities need to be involved because law enforcement alone can't solve this.
Definitely, and you even see that directly with all of those resources you shared. And in order to keep those documents updated, as most of them are updated even yearly, you need a team for each of them. So I do agree. We'll get back into how it's a team fight later in my questions. But Therese, you did mention investigative leads in your presentation, and we represent a research institute at UCF, as I shared earlier, and many of our members are here. Can you please discuss for us any known gaps currently in regards to human trafficking and modern slavery?
Well, I think there's the potential for a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential gaps out there. I mean, we're dependent in many cases on, especially in the current COVID environment where we're not traveling and getting around. We are dependent on the CSOs and the NGOs, the civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, for a lot of leads, also investigative journalists. But that can only take us sometimes so far. And so in areas where it's either there's a difficulty of access by the CSOs, by the NGOs, to some extent even by reporters now, there's certainly a gap there. So if there's any sort of research that can be done, to give you a good example, the Xinjiang region in China, it is very difficult to get into there and actually see on the ground what is going on because of the heavy surveillance, because of the blocking of access to journalists, et cetera, to auditors, to others who would be looking at what's going on there. If there's research that can be done another way, maybe then that would be of that type of research is of value. Any place where we are having trouble getting in a presence, that's a really big gap, and it would be helpful to us to be able to have greater visibility into what's actually happening on the ground there. And I realize that's a tough one. The Xinjiang is particularly tough for everyone.
Yes, and self-plug shout out to, we did have journalist Ian Urbina on the first part of this series, and he talked about how much of his work helped to bring light to specifically in fishery industries and other on the ocean fight against human trafficking. So a follow-up question to your research, you mentioned definitely the need to corroborate the information you receive. You shared with us even the process that if you're able to validate the information, you can even jump all the way to step 7, as opposed to being stuck at step 2. So can you elaborate for us how, when you need to research, you need to validate this information first and foremost?
Sure. So if we receive information and it says, oh, we believe this product is being made with forced labor in this country, and here's the indicators we have observed. So we have to take each of those indicators and look at those to say, okay, is this actually occurring? Is it really forced labor? Because sometimes people see things that they think are forced labor and it's not really forced labor within action we can take enforcement on. So we would be looking primarily to open source information to corroborate that. So information from other NGOs or CSOs, information from investigative journalists, information that perhaps companies themselves have published online, information we will try to talk to victims or other witnesses, to get information on what's happening on the ground. So, for example, Stephanie talked about fishing vessels. We have interviewed victims who have been workers who have been on fishing vessels where forced labor is occurring, things like that, so that we can corroborate that the information that's provided to us is accurate and that forced labor is in fact occurring. Because, as you can probably imagine, if we were to issue a withhold release order on an entity and there is no forced labor occurring, that has an adverse effect on legitimate U.S. businesses who are importing from that source. So we want to make sure that if we're acting, we're taking action against something where a violation of U.S. law is in fact occurring, and we have to get, like all law enforcement does an investigation, to make sure that the facts line up with what's being alleged. And I think you can look at that in almost any type of law enforcement investigation. That's a part of it.
I think that's right. And I'll just jump in that, the importer and the entity that we're targeting, they do have some legal recourse, as well. So it's really important that we can document and prove, what we're saying is true, because, there can be proceedings where they can appeal that decision.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. So Stephanie, you mentioned when you shared your information that all sectors of our economy and society, it would be ideal if they were aware of the issue of forced labor. And Therese, you said that from what you're seeing overall, there is political unity in the current fight against human trafficking and forced labor. My question for you both is, how much is the fight as well, not only the awareness, but the fight against human trafficking? How much of that is a team effort? And we need all parties involved.
Well, I'll just jump in right away, because I had already mentioned the Center for Countering Human Trafficking. So that's one other, and that's our CDP falls under the Department of Homeland Security, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations is one of our sister agencies in the department. And so they're the ones conducting the criminal investigations into forced labor. Then we also have the Department of Justice involved from the standpoint of any potential prosecutions. I mentioned, trade agreements and USTR's involvement. That's the United States Trade Representative involved there in putting provisions into agreements so that forced labor is prohibited in other countries. So, for example, when the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, which replaced NAFTA, went into force, there is a provision in there that requires Mexico and Canada to also prohibit imports made with forced labor. I mentioned the Departments of Labor and State being involved in this because they're doing a lot of the more of the on-the-ground research and work towards identifying potential forced labor conditions. So it's really a whole of U.S. government. You have U.S. aid doing programs to increase capacity overseas for countries to address forced labor within their borders. And then there's the role of the business community, which has the obligation, at least in the United States, to prevent forced labor. And there are certainly legal and reputational and financial risks to engaging in forced labor, because there's a reputational damage because consumers don't want to buy goods from companies that are facilitating forced labor, or you don't want to buy goods that are, or at least I don't want to buy goods that I know someone else is being enslaved to make this good so that's just a little bit cheaper for me. So I think we all have a role to play, and as consumers, there's a role you can play as well in trying to make sure you don't buy goods that are made with forced labor.
I'll jump in and also add, it's wonderful to be talking to academia, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. All of the educational institutions do source, food and various products, to run their organizations, to maintain your campuses and so on. So I think there's, an opportunity, for everyone to really look at where they're employed, where they're going to school, and see, are the products that are being purchased, free of forced labor, and if not, how we can help you as the U.S. government to make sure that does not happen.
Great, and we'll elaborate on that, please, with the role of the individual and what they can do to confirm that they're not supporting forced labor. And I'll go add to a couple audience questions to this, because it seems I'm not the only one that's curious, which I'm not surprised. But we have two audience questions of, is there a website someone can go to prove the company they're using isn't a potential partner or using forced labor themselves? Likewise, is there a site that they could go to make sure a product itself isn't made with forced labor?
Okay. Do you want to start, Therese? Or?
Sure. Oh, sure. I'm happy to start. So I'm looking at, I guess, the questions on the website. So I'll just go ahead and start with those. So if you're trying to look at where you can go to see if a partner is engaged in forced labor, you can look at the Department of Labor's list of goods. You can look at the Trafficking in Persons report from the Department of State, and you can certainly go to the CBP website and look at the withhold release orders that we've issued, look at the findings that we've issued, and identify products where we have actually determined that forced labor is occurring. That doesn't mean that there's we only have so many resources to devote to this, and that's, I guess, another challenge when you look at law enforcement as the solution. There's only so much bandwidth for investigations, but looking at those other resources and looking at media reporting, because I see a lot of articles in the press, investigative journalists doing work in this space, that if you're really interested in finding out more about this, there's a lot of places that you can look to see whether forced labor conditions exist for that product in that country. I would just also clarify, there's a comment about US-based e-commerce sites. The location of the site is not indicative as to whether forced labor exists in the product, because you can probably go on I'm not going to name US e-commerce sites, but you can certainly go on these sites and be buying products that are made with cotton grown in the Xinjiang, or with tomatoes grown in the Xinjiang that are produced with forced labor. And these are going to be on US websites. I think that's a big part of the challenge if you are a e-commerce platform, is how do you screen out all of these entities? I mean, it's a very challenging situation.
Yes, sorry, Stephanie, go ahead.
No, very much so. And certain industries, do some types of self-certification. There are certification programs. I think we are looking into what the effectiveness of some of those are, but certainly some industries do make an effort to self-certify, to train members of their trade, how to avoid forced labor in their supply chains. So it kind of depends. There are opportunities there, but we're going to continue to evaluate the effectiveness of those.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a great point, Stephanie. I'm sorry, Trish. I was just going to add on things. That's a great point about looking at the companies themselves, because if you're looking at the companies themselves, like, you can go to their websites and look to see, do they indicate any awareness supports? Like, do they have a social compliance program in place that indicates they're at least making the effort to avoid having suppliers that are using forced labor?
Yes, and I like the optimist attitude of it's an opportunity, and there's definitely an opportunity for maybe even one of the people joining us today to make a website of sorts that compiles the data already available and tries to be a one-stop shop for consumer education. So that's a seed planted for an idea, definitely. But for my last question, and then I'll move on to the all the audience questions. What do you two see as the biggest priority for the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery in your experience?
Wow. Okay, so that's actually a tough question. That's kind of a tough question to answer. I mean, I think from a humanistic perspective, from a human rights and human interest perspective, it's obviously getting victims who are people who are enslaved, getting help to them and getting them out of those conditions. That's not a role that CBP directly plays, in the sense that we're not on the ground to rescue people. We're not investigating the actual traffickers that are enslaving. We're investigating the entity that is actually using the labor and preventing the importations. But there's certainly I think, from a human rights perspective, it would be obviously improving the lives of people. And I do think, although I said we're not on the ground, where they can't actually rescue them, but we can have an impact in the work that CBP does in our program, is in sense of trying to get the foreign entities to change their practices. And that does happen on occasion. Stephanie mentioned that there is a way for entities that are the target of a WRO to get that order lifted by changing their business practice, changing their labor practices. And so to the extent that we can have an effect on that, that's probably a big priority. That's a big priority for CBP. And then also for us, our mission is, part of our mission is U.S. economic prosperity. So also keeping that playing field level for U.S. industry, so that our economy is not harmed by competition from goods that are made less expensively because they're using slave labor.
I definitely agree with that. Getting protection to people who need it. Now that's a hard thing, because you're dealing with a foreign country, foreign government, foreign business. I am aware that the Department of Labor does do a series of grant programs and technical assistance to kind of help train other countries, how to structure their legal system, how to structure their labor system and their monitoring. USAID, Agency for International Development, part of the U.S. Government, also, works on providing technical assistance. So I'm impressed with, the breadth across the U.S. Government, even the military. We've worked with the parts of the military on tracking fishing vessels, for example. So I think that, I'm impressed with the way, the government is coming together, and that's not an easy task across a very large government. But I think it is working, and, there are ways of us working together to do a better job. And then I just say, general awareness of the consumer, because that really matters in the long run. And I think we're all trying to find ways to engage. So again, we thank you for your invitation today, and, spread the word. And I'd probably not be amiss to encourage some of your students to consider Homeland Security somewhere in their future. I'll do that shame a little advertisement there. But greater awareness, it would be a great thing. So, keep researching, keep looking, and help us avoid forced labor. Every little bit counts, and everybody counts.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. I always say that everyone can fight to stop human trafficking and modern slavery using the skills they already developed. So thank you for sharing all of your information. We appreciate your perspective. Before we get to Q&A, just last call for any submitted questions, and I'll go ahead and show those survey results. So Brendan, if you could please put the survey results on the screen. We were asked you earlier in the conversation, which of these goods can be found to produce with child labor? 80% said all of the above. 80% you were correct. All of those goods were found to be forced with child or created with child or forced labor. You could see the whole list of the Department of Labor's list of goods. It was actually one of the references in your presentation. So thank you again for that. And to get to the first question submitted by the audience, they want to know who are some of the civil society organizations you work with to gather your data?
Wow, there are so many of them. We actually do a roundtable with the civil society and NGO organizations, and they have more. There are 50 or 60 of them that participate in that. Some of them that have been more public, for example, Liberty Shared, Greenpeace. They've been fairly public in the fact that they work with us. I prefer not to name entities that haven't voluntarily gone public, just because there are issues sometimes with people's safety, et cetera. So if somebody hasn't publicized that they work with CBP, then we don't usually publicize that information as well either. But those two, I believe, I know have been out in the public sphere. So happy to mention them.
Great. And I would add the
I can add also oh God, what is it? The name is legal. Oh, I'm sorry. The acronym is escaping me. The Legal Center for Human Trafficking. I'm sorry. The spell out of the name is escaping me.
No
sorry
problem.
about that.
All of us.
But they've been out in public as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to add that all of us here from UCF understand getting lost in the sea of acronyms. So our director who's joining us, the director of the HTMS Center, he has a history working with the CDC. And so as my old CDC, he asked if his old CDC colleagues are involved with this as they were with health issues in the DHS detention facilities or investigations involving potential health issues.
We, in terms of investigations for forced labor, we really have not been involved with the CDC. With regards to, I mentioned disposable gloves out of Malaysia, and some of those are medical, for the medical community. So we have been involved with more with HHS, more largely in FDA, to make sure that gloves that are not made with forced labor are getting into the country and are available to the medical community, and to expedite those shipments as much as possible. But we're not directly engaged with CDC.
Got you. Thank you. I have a question of curiosity, and it goes with what I was mentioning before with data coming directly from these survivors. How many of the reports, or percentage-wise, would you say are coming from these potential victims themselves?
I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I wouldn't put a number on it. I would say it's as I said earlier, though, the overwhelming majority are from the CSOs and NGOs, and or they're self-initiated by CBP based on, for example, media reporting. Yes,
gotcha. I really just wanted with that to emphasize the rarity of self-reporting in the situation. Well, thank you. We have, that was it of the audience submitted questions. Because we still have a little bit more of your time, I'll ask another question, especially because you mentioned the recent case of the gloves. So I'm wondering if you've seen directly with your research an impact of the pandemic.
I'm sorry, I'm not, I guess I'm not, an impact of the pandemic on
the human trafficking and modern slavery.
Well, I will say this, we have seen, if you already got people in abusive living and working conditions, certainly a failure to provide appropriate PPE to protect them from COVID has been an issue. I mean, there are entities whom we have WROs that have had big outbreaks of COVID within their operations because there is a lack, because of the poor sanitation, the crowded housing conditions, the crowded working conditions, inadequate sanitation, lack of masks and sanitizer and soap. It's I mean, to be very, not even, these things are missing. So we have seen an impact, a nexus between forced labor conditions and outbreaks of COVID.
I think that's a good point to make. And, obviously the pandemic came upon us and, we were all dealing with it. But going forward for the future, it's something for us to think about and maybe anticipate and, be able to predict that, when we have certain types of situations, certain types of products are all going to be sopped up, maybe largely by developing countries, and that, that could lead to more forced labor. So I think some strategizing there and really thinking through that, I'm sure is, going to be in our future. So thanks for raising that question.
Yes, and thank you for sharing. And I would agree the pandemic definitely has forced a lot of learning lessons, and there's more to come, I'm sure. So we do have time for one last submitted question that just snuck in from the audience. So what does the CBP do with respect to products manufactured at a facility where there is a suspicion of forced labor, but where the government of the country where the product is made is uncooperative and prevents the investigation?
Excellent question, because that certainly does happen. So we have to get creative. We can't, when there's no way to get into a region to actually boots on the ground look ourselves, but there's a lot of information that is available online that you can get to. There is, we attempt to talk to people who have been there. We can't get there. There is a problem, particularly with, I mentioned earlier, the access to the Xinjiang is very, very difficult. But we are able to look at, we do research in Mandarin, and we read what people post on Weibo and WeChat and Baidu. And we look at what companies say about themselves, because it's amazing how many entities self-incriminate. They incriminate themselves. And then there's certainly a lot of creativity that goes on when you can't get to a site. And Stephanie maybe will add something on this, of what, because there's work with fishing vessels where we can't get to that vessel to see what's going on, but yet there are ways to look at risk indicators there and identify those things through some creative means without actually going physically to the vessel. And I don't know, Stephanie, if you want to add to that.
Sure. Actually, there have been situations where, like, Greenpeace has been able to get aboard a ship or track a ship and find out, interview the crew and find out, what has been happening, in that. We do have some indications of where, maybe an abusive captain has been transferred from one ship to another. So, there can be good sources, and also our global partners, like the European Union, they have issued something very similar to a, withhold release order, maybe, prior to us finding out about it. So we can look and see, how many of our partners have found the same things and, prosecuted cases, that are similar to ours, kind of hopefully helping us predict, where we might find forced labor and where we need to be looking. So we do have some global partners that do similar work.
Excellent, excellent. Persistence is definitely key in this fight. So I'm sure you appreciate all the partners. Well, we appreciate your time today. I definitely would like to make sure we end on time, and thank you for all of the information you shared. As I mentioned to the group earlier, all of our previous discussions of this series, as well as our first 3-part series, is available on the UCF Global page. So please check it out. We encourage you to look out for our upcoming Lunch and Learn series this summer. And if you have any questions or concerns, you could reach us at htmscenter@ucf.edu directly, and we'll have one of our advisory board members answer you as promptly as possible. So thank you again to Rez and Stephanie for your time. The Center for Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, as we presented this series, we thank everyone who contributes to the center functioning and being able to present these to you all. So again, thank you all for joining us, and be well and have a good rest of your day, please.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for participating.